Jose Marti was a poet, philosopher, essayist, and Cuban national hero who is accredited with one saying: "Those who have you, or liberty, do not know you. Those who do not have you should not speak of you, but win you." Marti was very politically active during the process of Cuban liberation from the Spanish Empire. He is considered an extremely important revolutionary philosopher and political theorist to this day. While he was the main architect of the Cuban War of Independence of 1895, his passion and drive to see a free democratic Republic of Cuba would stem from a multitude of incidents throughout his life. But the 10-year War of 1868 to 1878 was of paramount importance for the martyr. The 10 Years' War, also referred to as the Guerra Grande or Great War, started in 1868, but like every political conflict in which people fight for liberty and freedom, the causes started much before. With the arrival of Christopher Columbus in Bariay, now the Holguin province, the Spanish Empire saw potential in what for Europeans was an extraordinary discovery and proceeded to conquer the island and its natives, something they would use to continue their expansion through the Americas. Cuba would stay as a colony of the Spanish Empire, and it wouldn't really prosper economically until 1760, when Spain let Cuba trade with foreign ships. A combination between the sugar industry and introduction of slavery by the Spanish Empire began a great sugar boom that lasted over 120 years. Cuba was then nicknamed the Pearl of the Antilles. The British abolished the slave trade in 1807 with the Slave Trade Act. Then it was followed by the Spanish in 1820, which stopped an influx of new slaves into the island and ended up hurting the Cuban economy. The Cuban sugar plantation owners started a relentless focus on improving the island's sugar technology. Between 1856 and 1860, around 90,000 slaves were still coming to the island despite slave abolitionist movements and new technologies which made a great amount of slaves counterproductive and expensive. Some found it more profitable to hire Chinese immigrants as indentured workers, something they thought would also get them ahead of the presumed emancipation of slaves. By 1870, there were around 125,000 Chinese immigrants in Cuba. Cuba, since the beginning, was being exploited by the Spanish Empire, with Spaniards being considered a higher class than Cuban-born whites and Creoles, and Spaniards also controlled 90% of the economy, even though they were 8% of the population. The Spanish government was also taxing and setting harsh tariffs, all without proper Cuban representation on the Spanish parliament. In 1865, the Cuban Creole elites gave Spanish parliament 4 demands. Number 1, a tariff reform. Number 2, Cuban representation in parliament. Number 3, judicial equality with Spaniards. And finally, number 4, full enforcement of the slave trade ban. All 4 demands were completely shut down by the Spanish parliament. In July of 1867, the Revolutionary Committee of Bayamo was founded by Francisco Vicente Aguilera, who at the time was the wealthiest plantation owner in the whole country. The conspiracy spread rapidly throughout eastern Cuba, and in no time it got to Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes was a small plantation owner who was known in the area for being strongly against Spanish rule. Céspedes would proceed to make preparations to raise up in arms and fight the Spanish. Céspedes had planned to begin the war on October 14, 1868, but the Spanish army caught wind of the rebellion and the day had to be moved up. On October 10, 1868, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes proclaimed Cuba an independent nation, while also liberating his slaves, which in turn joined the war in his favor. He would then proceed to call on all men of all races to join the fight for freedom. He rang the Mills bell while raising the new flag for independent Cuba. The 10th of October Manifesto was written and signed by 16 people, including Céspedes. Our aim is to enjoy the benefits of freedom, for whose God created man. We sincerely profess a policy of brotherhood, tolerance, and justice, and to consider all men equal, and to not exclude anyone from these benefits, not even Spaniards, if they choose to remain and live peacefully among us. Our aim is that the people participate in the creation of laws and in the distribution and investment of the contributions. Our aim is to abolish slavery and to compensate those deserving compensation. We seek freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom to bring back honest governance, and to honor and practice the inalienable rights of men, which is the foundation of the independence and the greatness of our people. Our aim is to throw off the Spanish yoke and to establish a free and independent nation. It will have a constitutional government created in an enlightened manner. At the time, the Spanish colonial government in the island had around 33,000 soldiers, while Céspedes' rebellion would max out at 12,000. In these 12,000 men there was Máximo Gómez. Máximo Gómez was a Dominican Republic native and cavalry officer for the Spanish army in his homeland. Gómez would proceed to emigrate to Cuba and become a rebel under the Céspedes rebellion. Máximo Gómez would be the man who would teach the Cuban rebels their most lethal tactic, the machete charge. The rebels were completely outnumbered 1-2 and were extremely minuscule when it came to armament and training. The rebels would adapt a strategy of guerrilla warfare combined with a machete charge to intercept Spanish caravans and squadrons. By October 13th, just 3 days later, the rebels conquered the important city of Bayamo. In the middle of the battle, poet and musician Perucho Figueredo composed the national anthem, La Bayamesa, which you have been listening to. The first provisional government of the rebels was established in the new conquered city. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes was chosen as the head. Spain would proceed by drawing a strategy where they would divide the island in half between east and west, with a reinforced system of trenches and watchtowers in the middle. This would, in their eyes, limit the war to the eastern side while completely preserving the wealthy west and the capital Havana. This, though, did very little to stop the rebels in the beginning. A month later, on November 4th, 1868, the province of Camagüey rose up in arms, then followed by Las Villas in early 1869. There was a small clandestine uprising in the western provinces, which was actually put down by the Spanish army. A multitude of people were captured. One of them was a 16-year-old boy named José Julián Martí Pérez, who would later become one of the most important people in Cuban and Latin American history. Martí would be sentenced to 16 years of hard labor and was later deported to Spain. Céspedes would replace Máximo Gómez as head of the army with Thomas Jordan, a veteran of the Confederate States Army in the American Civil War. Jordan brought well-equipped forces, but Jordan cousin's reliance on regular tactics instead of the guerrilla-style warfare was leaving the rebels' families wide open for the ruthless tactics of ethnic cleansing by Spanish General Blas Villate. General Jordan would later resign and Céspedes would reinstate Máximo Gómez as the head of the army. On April 10, 1869, a constitutional assembly took place in the newly freed province of Camagüey. This was intended to create a government that would provide greater organization and instructional unity for the rebels. There was a common consensus on the importance of the separation of powers between the army and the civil government. Céspedes would be elected as the head of the assembly. General Ignacio Agramonte and Loinaz, together with Antonio Zambrana, were the principal authors of the new constitution. The Constitution of 1869 would be called the Guaymalló Constitution. The central feature was the elected House of Representatives legislature that would appoint the president, who would be in charge of the executive branch. This legislature would also appoint the chief of the military, with both the president and the chief of the military answering completely to the legislature. The island will be divided into 4 regions, with all 4 having the same representation. The Constitution established the right to elect and be elected, and to recognize that all inhabitants of the Republic were free. The Assembly would then be converted to the legislature and would have the supreme power of the land. The legislature would then select Salvador Cisneros Betancourt as the president of the legislature, Miguel Jerónimo Gutiérrez as the legislature vice president, and would then appoint Agramonte and Zambrana as secretaries. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes was officially elected president of the Republic at Arms on April 12, 1869, and General Manuel de Quesada, a Mexican veteran during the French invasion of Mexico, was then elected as the chief of the armed forces. During the first half of 1869, the Spanish colonial government would pass several laws to exterminate the rebellion. Examples of these laws are: number 1, all arrested leaders and collaborators of the insurgency were to be executed on the spot. Number 2, all ships carrying weapons would be seized and everyone on board would be executed on the spot. The Spanish colonial government had not only the Spanish army at their disposal, but also a voluntary corps. This voluntary corps would become incredibly infamous for committing horrible atrocities. One of them was the execution of 8 medical students who were accused of defacing the tomb of a Spanish general. To this day, though, it is still in contention whether the students did it or if they were framed in order to punish someone and set an example. With some time, a new generation of battle-tested Cuban generals rose through the ranks. Antonio Maceo Grajales, an Afro-Cuban general who survived a total of 27 shots through the war and was later nicknamed the Bronze Titan. Another battle-tested Cuban general included General Calixto Garcia and Federico Fernandez Cavadas. Cavadas was raised in the United States with an American mother. Cavadas had experience as a colonel in the Union Army during the American Civil War. On April 4, 1879, Fernando Cavadas was named the Commander-in-Chief of all Cuban Revolutionary Forces. Someone who deserves a tremendous amount of respect is Mariana Grajales, General Antonio Maceo's mother. Mariana Grajales was born in Santiago de Cuba to Dominican parents. She would marry Marcos Maceo and she would have a total of 13 children. For her and her family, the fight for Cuban freedom was a whole family affair. At first, her husband Marcos wasn't for support of Cuban independence, but a series of events would change his opinion. One of these events was the terror unleashed by Spanish Captain General Leopoldo O'Donnell during a slave revolt in Matanzas, which was later referred to as the Stair Conspiracy, named this way for the scaffold resembling a stair on which the rebel slaves were flogged to death. After this, much resembling the silent witch trials, more than 1,000 slaves were put to prison in the flimsiest of evidence. Many would die of diseases, torture, and neglect. During the 10 Years' War, Mariana Grajales ran a mountain settlement and improvised bush hospitals, where she would take care and save thousands of lives. One time, after a gruesome battle, Mariana was going through the never-ending wounded rebels when she saw one of her sons, Miguel, laying with a clearly fatal wound. She would take a good look at him, then noticing her youngest sitting in the corner. She would then tell him in a clear and audible voice to all in camp, "And you, stand up straight. Now is the time for you to go into a campaign. For the cause to succeed, one son must replace the other." When her husband Marcos died in battle, in the hands of his son Antonio, he whispered, "I've done what Mariana wanted." Martin himself would later witness Mariana and Antonio's wife rush into the battlefield to rescue a wounded Antonio and save him. He would later say, "It's easy to be heroes with women such as this." She would later be named the Mother of Cuba. In 1870, Legislature Secretary Ignacio Agramonte, after some issues in the legislature, realized that his dream constitution was ill-suited to the current republic at arms. He would then resign as secretary and take command of the Central Forces later in 1870. Agramonte would become a loyal supporter of President Céspedes, even though Agramonte was under the direct leadership of the Chief of the Armed Forces and not the President. In 1872, a civil war broke out in the Spanish mainland, and attention and manpower had to be allocated to the fight threat at home. With the Spanish occupied on their homeland with internal conflicts, 1873 would become the peak year of the war, with the island in constant conflict. General Agramonte, while in charge of the Central Forces, was killed in action by a stray bullet on May 11, 1873. His position would be filled by General Máximo Gómez, but Agramonte's death hit the rebels' morale incredibly hard. The legislature was growing worried of President Céspedes, abusing his authority, and was caught multiple times going around the legislature and the Chief of the Armed Forces to give instructions to the rebels. The death of General Agramonte, together with political and personal disagreements, drove the legislature to depose President Céspedes in a coup. The legislature would appoint Cisneros, the previous legislature president, as the second president of the Republic at arms. While the rebels were making big strides towards unity and solidarity on the surface, like creating a whole government and promote battle-tested rebels to national figures, if you really analyze it in depth, the scars were there, and they were deep. The biggest issue with the rebels was the difficulties they had unifying under the same goal. Máximo Gómez was extremely controversial with his strategies of burning sugar plantations to harm the Spanish economy, while the Afro-Cuban Bronze Titan, General Antonio Maceo, had risen to be a main figure in the war and had acquired a strong popularity and loyalty and admiration among the black rebels. This would start to worry certain white nationalists who were worried about the fear of Marcel leading a racial rebellion. The division among the rebels regarding the organization of government and military leadership became a bigger issue after Cespedes was deposed as president. The Spanish would take advantage of the situation by exploiting regional divisions and by fueling fears of the slaves in the province of Matanzas, breaking the weak balance between the white and blacks in the province. This way, they were able to keep control of the Spanish battlefront from the rebel sympathy. The colonial government would also change their policy towards the rebels, offering them amnesties and reform, this way weakening the fragile unity between them. After Cespedes was deposed from his position as president, he had intended to leave Cuba for the US to help prepare armed expeditions to join the war in Cuba, but the Cisneros government banned him from leaving the island and left him with only one escort. The Spanish army would take advantage of the opportunity, and on February 27, 1874, Carlos Manuel de Cespedes was killed by a patrol of Spanish troops. Another martyr death would not be beneficial news for the movement. From 1872 to 1875, the rebel operations were focused and limited to the eastern part of Cuba. General Maximo Gomez would begin the western invasion of Cuba in 1875, but the vast majority of slaves and wealthy sugar producers in the region did not join or support the revolt, making the invasion and western expedition a failure. During this invasion, General Gomez's most trusted general and close friend, Henry Reef, a former drummer boy for the Union Army during the American Civil War, was killed in action. The death of Henry Reef, the failed attempt to expand west, dwindling union among the rebels and officers, from Las Villas refusing to follow him because he wasn't a Cuban native, would just be too much for the great general. He would proceed to quit the war in 1876. The Spanish Civil War would end in 1876. The perfect window for a rebel victory had come to an end and had been spent dealing with inner issues and not coming together for the win. The Spanish would then turn around and focus their strength on taking down the rebels once and for all. They would commit General Arsenio Martinez Campos with a grand total of 250,000 troops, which completely dwarfed the 12,000 Cuban rebels. Neither side was able to claim a major victory or crush the other side. The end of the war was 3 years of slow disintegration of the rebels, while Spain gained more and more of the upper hand. A few years prior, Juan Bautista Espotosto was appointed as the third president of the Republic at Arms, who was then replaced by Tomás Estrada Palma as the fourth president. On October 19, 1877, President Tomás Estrada Palma was captured by Spanish troops, and just a year later, in 1878, after 10 years of war, the constitutional government of the Cuban Republic at Arms was dissolved. The few remaining leaders would start negotiations for peace in San Juan, Puerto Príncipe. The Pact of San Juan promised that Cuba would have some sort of representation in the Spanish parliament, granted a general amnesty for all political offenses since 1868, and freed all prisoners of war with the condition that leaders who were free would have to leave the island, and Afro-Cubans who fought for either side would be free from slavery. The pact also promised more freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. This gave pathway to the Partido Liberal Autonomista, which advocated for reform without independence. A multitude of new black organizations were formed to advance their civil rights agenda, until Spain outlawed slavery in the island in 1880 and approved a plan to gradually fade the practice out, in which plantation owners would have to pay their slaves. Slavery was completely abolished in 1886. The pact was signed by a negotiation committee on February 10, 1878, but General Antonio Maceo, disgusted by the decision to not outlaw slavery outright, kept a small resistance in the eastern provinces. They would protest in Los Mangos de Baragua on March 15, 1878, but the provisional government founded after the San Juan Pact was signed was able to convince General Maceo to surrender. After consuming more than 200,000 lives, the war would officially come to an end on May 28, 1878. This 10-year struggle can understandably be seen as an impotent rebellion that failed to materialize a victory against the Spanish Empire. After all, there was a lot of progress being made in the first few years. But the reality is that without this conflict, Cuban independence from the Spanish Empire as we know it would have been completely non-existent, since the heroes of this war would become the heroes and leaders of the Cuban War of Independence of 1895 to 1898. Our heroes scattered across the world after 1878, General Antonio Maceo and his mother, Mariana Grajales, would flee Cuba for Jamaica, having gained international fame for their commitment and stance on slavery. General Calixto Garcia would be released from prison in Spain and left for Paris, where he began raising funds for the next phase of the movement. Tomás Estrada Palma was exiled to the United States, and General Máximo Gómez would stay active in the Cuban independence movement and would actually offer financing and his leadership to a proposed independent movement in Puerto Rico. Gómez would also supervise a laborers' brigade during the construction of the Panama Canal. José Martí was freed with amnesty and proceeded to travel the Americas, becoming a world-famous poet, and got involved in the Cuban independent movement by becoming the main philosopher and hero. Martí would be the one to bring together all these heroes and reunite them for the War of Independence of 1895. He would sadly die of a gunshot wound on the Battle of Dos Rios, but his legacy would help the Mambises push through to win the war and gain independence from Spain. But sadly, Cuba will still be searching for real freedom for more than 120 years.